I'm Wade Clark Roof, Director of the Walter H. Capps Center for the Study of Ethics, Religion, and Public Life at the University of California at Santa Barbara. I'm delighted to have as my guest this evening Diana Eck, Professor of Comparative Religion and Indian Studies at Harvard University. Diana Eck has written many books, numerous articles on religion in India and in other parts of the world. But in the past 10 years or so, her interest focused particularly on the United States and the growing impact of religious pluralism in our culture. And in 2001, she authored this very important book entitled A New Religious America, with a very interesting subtitle, How a Christian Country Has Become the World's Most Religiously Diverse Nation. It's an intriguing topic. Professor Eck, I'd like to ask you if you would tell us a bit about how you got interested in religious pluralism in the United States and something about your project, the Project on Pluralism at Harvard University.
Thank you, Clark. It's great to be here. And I think my interest in religious pluralism really began with my interest in India. India is, after all, an old multi-religious nation. And my research there brought me into contact with Hindus and Sikhs and Muslims and Christians and Jews and Buddhists. One really gains a sense of the religious diversity of the world by studying and working in India. And along about 1990, I began to notice in my own teaching about India that the students in the class were beginning to change. The demographics of the classroom at Harvard University was changing. And a lot of that was because there were students who were not foreign students from India, but were American-born students of Indian origin who were in my classes on the world's religions or on the religious traditions of India. And they were Muslims who'd grown up in Chicago, and Sikhs who'd grown up in Pittsburgh, and Hindus who'd grown up in Delaware. And I realized I didn't know very much about these religious traditions in their American context. In fact, I had been in India in 1965 as a student when the new Immigration and Nationalities Act was passed. And in the years since then, I had sort of taken note of the fact of what this would mean for India. The fact that it meant a kind of brain drain, as we called it, as Indian doctors and engineers came to the United States. And yet, I have to confess, I never really thought of what it would mean for the United States until these students, really the children of the new immigration, showed up in my classroom. So the genesis of studying religious diversity in America really came from the changing demography of my university. And I figured I needed to find out more about Hindu communities and Muslims and Sikhs in the United States. And so I began this research project.
That's fascinating. It's interesting that you, a professor, starting in your career interested in India, would discover that the pluralism that you discovered there was becoming increasingly something in your own country. And many of us had not seen that, and suddenly we became more aware that ours is a very religiously pluralistic place. It's always been pluralistic, of course, but somewhat more narrowly conceived. Now we've got all of these great world religious traditions represented here in the United States, so it's a quite different scene, isn't it? It
is a different scene, and even figuring out who's here at the beginning was a real challenge. And the first thing I did as a sort of predecessor to the Pluralism Project was to teach a seminar. You don't know anything about it as a professor. That's what you often do, is I think I'll teach a seminar about that. So I announced a seminar on world religions in Boston. And what we did was really to remap the religious landscape of Boston. We visited the new Hindu temple that was being built in the suburbs, a temple dedicated to the goddess Lakshmi. And we visited old and new Islamic centers and found there were 6 or 7 of them in the suburbs of Boston, to say nothing of all the Islamic centers and communities at the university. And we found Vietnamese temples, Buddhist temples in Roslindale and Dorchester and East Boston, and there were Cambodian Buddhist temples in the northern suburbs, and Chinese Buddhist temples down in Quincy, and a Jain temple in an old former Swedish Lutheran church in Norwood. And this really was just a fascinating thing to me in the town I had by then lived in for 15 years, to visit religious communities, to bring my students to those communities as well, to begin to build bridges of relationship with those people, and to learn a lot more about the challenges of Boston.
And then
from there, yeah, I realized that what was happening in Boston was probably happening elsewhere, so I applied for a grant. At first it was from the Lilly Endowment to have student researchers do hometown research over the summer, over a period of a couple of years, and go to Oklahoma City and Chicago and Minneapolis and San Francisco Bay Area and do some research on what was happening in those areas of the country. So really the Pluralism Project at the beginning was asking three kinds of research questions. The first was really basic demographics, to try to get a sense through the lens of American cities and towns of how many Islamic centers and mosques and Sikh gurdwaras and Hindu temples were there. Who's here was really the first question, because we don't do a religious census in this country, and we literally had no idea who we are. And the second question was really something that came more out of my work as an historian of religion, which is how are these traditions changing in the American context? What does it mean to build a Hindu temple in the suburbs of Boston and sort of bring the ritual life of a South Indian community into this context? What does it mean to develop a Thai Buddhist community in Phoenix, Arizona? What are the ways in which all religious life changes in the process of immigration? And, as someone who studies the dynamism of religious traditions, here it is, happening in front of our eyes. So that was our second question. How are these traditions taking root in American soil? How are they changing? And then our third question was really, how's America changing? And that's one that we keep working at, because that is a very complicated question. How do we, the people of the United States of America, in all the places where we come together, how are we coping with this new religious diversity?
those are all very, very important questions. And I want to ask you about particularly the last two, number 2 and number 3. Now, when you speak of Cambridge, Massachusetts, or California, and particularly Southern California, it's really not too surprising that one encounters religious pluralism. But if you go to Ames, Iowa, or Nebraska, or many parts of Ohio, and certainly in the Deep South, our assumptions are that there's not very much pluralism there. But it's been changing there too, hasn't it?
It really has. And of course, one of the things that you do when you're investigating something is you have your antenna out and your attention focused on something that many people simply aren't paying attention to. So, you know, they would drive right by the mosque in Oklahoma City and not notice it was there because it's in a former gymnasium. Mm-hmm. Or, you know, they would not really be aware of the Hindu and Buddhist communities in North Carolina because they're in rural parts of the state. It might be a monastery in Bolivia, North Carolina, or something like that. People aren't so attuned to this. And so in one sense, the presence of these communities in places that would be surprising is invisible to us, in part because the communities themselves don't stand out and announce themselves. They are, you know, a mosque that is in a former U-Haul dealership in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, or something of the sort. And when it's your subject of investigation to visit them, then you discover that the familiar really houses a new community of new strangers who are amongst us as part of our fabric here in the United States. So it's not just a bi-coastal thing. We have had Pluralism Project researchers over the years affiliated with a university in Kentucky and looking at the religious diversity on the strip between Louisville and Nashville. We've had researchers in North Carolina, in northern Florida, in Mississippi and Arkansas, in Ohio. Ohio, as it turns out, is just a wealthy state when it comes to recognizing the new religious diversity. And in fact, in the centenary anniversaries that they had in Ohio a couple of years ago, they put markers on some of the first mosque, the Hindu temples, the gurdwaras of Ohio, as part of their historical society recognition of what had been going on there. So it is surprising, and that's been part of the real excitement of a project like this.
Well, that sounds fascinating. I want to pick up on one thing you said, that often these new religious groups meet in places that you wouldn't recognize as a religious center. And therefore, there's a kind of question there about public visibility, isn't there?
Yes.
But as many of these populations have moved to the suburbs, and what we typically say here in the United States, moved into the middle class, they become much more publicly visible, participating in the communities in which they live, taking a role in the public schools, becoming citizens and expressing themselves in terms of their civic activities. So is it the case, I assume you would agree, that this public visibility has brought increased attention to the consciousness of other Americans about their presence?
It's very, very true. It's visibility in terms of participation, as you mentioned. They become part of the PTA. They become part of the people who show up at City Council when they are putting a petition for a zoning variance or something, perhaps for one of their gurdwaras or temples. They encounter neighbors in a kind of public way like that. The visibility also entails a certain amount of vulnerability. As these religious institutions become more recognizable, they also become at times the targets of people who are not so comfortable with the fact that they're present among us. So, and that has always been the case, whether it's churches or synagogues, and now mosques or gurdwaras or Hindu temples, as they become visible public statements of who they are, they become vulnerable targets if people are uncomfortable with who they are. So going back into the 80s, one of the new Hindu temples in Pittsburgh, for example, was vandalized by people who broke in and smashed the deities on the altar and tore up the holy book of the Sikhs, because the Sikhs had their own altar in that temple at the time, and wrote the word "leave" across the altar. And similarly, after 9/11, many of the most strident attacks against Muslim communities were precisely at the places where they were most visible. The mosque in Cleveland, the mosque outside Toledo, or in Chicago, or in Denver, were the places where that very visibility created a kind of vulnerability.
Yes.
That also, by the way, is true with the way in which the new Americans dress. And the places where discrimination is most likely to happen are the people who are the most visibly different. And that includes women wearing the hijab or the headscarf, and turbaned Sikh men. They're the ones who kind of attract the attention as people who are amongst us and wearing visible markers of their difference.
I want to switch to that third question, and as you pointed out, it's a very complex issue of how the presence of what you're calling the new Americans, how their presence is changing the United States, how it's changing the American culture. It seems to me that right now we're in a situation in this country where, where there's this big issue about what kind of country is this?
Yeah.
It's in our politics. We've just been through a presidential election. Are we a Christian country? Are we a pluralist country? And what does pluralist country mean in this context? How plural can we be if we're pluralist? Are we a secular country?
Yeah.
What is the proper role of religion in the political or public sphere? So how do you locate your observations about religious pluralism in this current context of political conversation about what is the proper role of religion in our national, public, and particularly in our political life today?
It's a really, really important question, and it's a complicated question, as you say. I mean, there's one way in which, constitutionally, we are a nation that is pledged to the non-establishment of religion and the free exercise of religion. Both of those are the principles, a kind of dual set of rudders that are there in the First Amendment to the Constitution in the Bill of Rights. And so that has in some ways really guided us through a period of expanding religious diversity. We're not supposed to have an established religion, even though throughout American history, really beginning in the 19th century and continuing right up to the middle of the 20th century, there were actual movements to write Christianity into the preamble to the Constitution. Happily, most of those have failed, and happily the judiciary does a pretty good job of trying to guide this issue. We're a Christian majority country. 80% of us are Christians or so. And then we have all of these religious minorities. And then we have the people who have the constitutional right not to have any religious tradition themselves, nor to have religion forced on them in some sort of public fashion as citizens. So these are difficult issues. My main concern is that we really recognize the multi-religious nature of America, that when we speak of religion in the public sphere, we don't speak as if we were just a Judeo-Christian nation, speak in that normative language that leaves everyone else out of our line of vision, that sort of drops them from the articulated, publicly noticed forms of religious life. And for many Americans, when they speak of religion in America, that's all they think about. They think of Christian America or of Judeo-Christian America at most. And they're not thinking in their mind's eye from sea to shining sea. They're not thinking of that mosque in Toledo or the Hindu temple in Nashville or the Sikh Gurdwara in El Sobrante. They really are, seeing everything from the little white New England church to the Crystal Cathedral, really. That's what religion means. And I think my concern is to make quite clear that religion in America is multiple, and that religious diversity is part of the precious inheritance of religious freedom. That's why we have religious diversity. So that's the sort of ethos that I think pluralism seeks to engender. But then the other important piece is, what about the privileging of religion over non-religion? The people who either came here as immigrants because they had had quite enough of religious oppression in their country of origin, or who live here as Americans quite happy with the fact that religion is not forced upon us as citizens. People are free to be religious in the many, many ways that they are. But as a citizen, you don't have to profess your religion. And that's another complicated scenario.
It's how to balance one's religious life and one's life as a citizen.
Exactly.
And we are both, or many Americans are both, or even the secular American is a citizen. So the issue of religion or secularity has to be somehow juxtaposed with their identity as a citizen. And therein lies the rub, does it not?
It does indeed.
That part of the problem is that you know, if the one argument on this issue is, well, look, we've been a very religious country throughout our history, although sometimes that early history of America is exaggerated and it's seen now as or thought to be more religious than perhaps it actually was. But nonetheless, grant that argument, we've been a religious country. Why should it not become, or why should it not remain a religious country? And then others take the line, well, you know, it's also been a Christian, predominantly a Christian country throughout its history. And then in the 1950s, people started talking about Judeo-Christian. So why should it not remain that?
Yeah.
So it becomes an issue of how do we weigh our heritage, which is looking to the past,
Yes.
over against some unfolding vision of America
Yeah.
that suggests it could be changing.
Yeah. This is so important because you and I both grew up in an era when, at least I went to elementary school in Bozeman, Montana, and nobody ever complained about having a Christmas pageant in the school. We always had Christmas pageants. It was just, you know, that word normative, it's what we thought of as normal. Now, the reason that that sort of heritage has now come into question, and we have the December dilemma, and this last year a lot of flap about whether you could say Christmas rather than happy holidays, etc., is partly because of this new diversity and the pluralism that it represents. As we become more diverse, we are recognizing and having to face the sort of normative elements of Christianity that have gotten intertwined with our citizenship in ways that now we see may have been inappropriate. Maybe not inappropriate for then, but inappropriate for now. And that really is where it starts to hurt people. I think our new diversity has made us recognize some of the ways in which the separation of church and state, so to speak, is really a very good thing for us. Because church means all sorts of things here. Now, it doesn't mean just church. It means synagogue and mosque and gurdwara and temple. And, you know, if we were to have prayers in the public schools, we would have to, you and I write a prayer book from Apache to Zoroastrian, and we probably make a lot of money at it. But, you know, this isn't the way we want to proceed, I think. I think we need to be able to identify, as you say, what is our role as citizens and what is appropriate in our civic life and what is appropriate in our religious life. And
Yes.
Tocqueville said it well when he visited America in the early 19th century, and he said, you know, it's a funny thing. Here, religion and freedom seem to march in the same direction. And that wasn't the experience in France. Freedom meant turning away from religion. And in part, it is because religion was uncoupled from the support of government. And it was a bold experiment. People hadn't really thought of it before, but somehow religion became stronger when it was separated from the support of government. And, you know, that's why we have 15 different kinds of Baptists. If you don't like your Baptist church, you can start another one. And that is the recipe for religious multiplicity. That's why Muslims who come to the United States are really happy to see this as what they would sometimes refer to as Dar al-Islam, a land of Islam, because Islam can flourish here without restrictions on the very freedom that other people cherished for themselves. Well, at least until recently. Now, of course, you know, we have the FBI looking at Islamic centers with a bit of a suspicious eye. But basically, religion has flourished here because it has been free.
Yes. You mentioned Tocqueville, and he was so masterful in his observations about American life, and so many of them continue to resonate with us. In particular, the point about religion and freedom march together here, because that has given life to religion as a voluntary phenomenon, independent of the state. And yet there's a shadow side to this, it seems to me, which is that in times of some insecurity, some religious groups, particularly those who identify with the historical heritage of the United States as Protestant, may now want the state to defend that religion because presumably it has a kind of authenticity in the American experience that others may not presume. So there's that interesting shadow side to the argument, is there not? You follow what I'm saying? That some particularly conservative Christians today who feel threatened by the presence of so many religions would actually want the state, in one way or another, to make sure through faith-based initiatives or through public rhetoric that is rooted in that tradition, to give it a nod of approval rather than recognizing or approving other religions. Do you see any of that going on?
We certainly see it going on. I think a lot of the faith-based initiatives work is really aimed at conservative Christian faith-based groups. It's an odd thing in some ways that people who are often in the majority, when they see the flowering of many others in society, begin to develop a minority consciousness and a feeling of threat. Why this should be the case, I don't know, because every religious community has the option, really, of forming a separate voluntary organization, nonprofit corporation, a 501c3 as we call it in the tax status, that has the aim of delivering the kinds of services they have, whether it's in hospital or hospice or drug rehabilitation or prison work. They can form a separate body that is not about the preaching of their religious life. But I do think the faith-based initiative issue is a very serious one, because what we're really gambling with is the very heritage that Tocqueville recognized as our strength and that our Constitution recognizes as its strength. I mean, it's not as if the people who were the framers of the Constitution didn't think about maybe we should just establish Christianity in general rather than some particular sect of Christianity as a kind of good national foundation for our ethos. They thought about it and they rejected it. And so should we. I think that the recipe for religious freedom and religious flourishing is something that we've done well with, and we probably shouldn't tamper with. And that doesn't mean that faith-based initiatives aren't really very positive things, because they are. But we need to rely on the voluntarism of our communities of faith to do that work, rather than subsidize that with government support. There you're really mixing the government coffers with those of the church, so to speak, and it is mostly churches, in ways that I think threaten the very constitutional heritage of our country.
The issue I think we face today is that many Americans seem caught between certainly adhering to a view that religion is voluntaristic over against what are the rights of the majority to prevail in the public sphere, to have their religious beliefs dictate the moral, ethical standards of the society. So that conflict between, yes, you're entitled to have whatever religion you want, but there is a majority, and the majority must set the tone. And you're going to have to. You can practice your minority faith, but you'll have to live with the majority, or else you should leave the country. There's some of that sentiment.
There
expressed.
Certainly is. I mean, my colleague Sam Huntington has expressed that pretty strongly at Harvard University in that book called "Who Are We?"
Yes.
And his "we" is really the old Anglo-Protestant we on which our country and heritage is based. And he raises a kind of histrionic cry about all of the so-called cults of diversity that have invaded the United States. It is sort of strange language in a way, because diversity is hardly an ideology. Diversity is our reality, and it's a good reality in my view. It's one that really provides the nourishment for the creativity of our society. But I do think it's the case that, and we certainly saw some of it in the rhetoric of this past 2004 election, that that the majority wants to flex its muscle and become emboldened to say, you know, it's really we who are the people who set the tone and ethos of the United States. And, you know, we do have a democratic process through which our officials from the local to the national level are elected by the majority. We also have a judicial system, and their obligation is to defend the Constitution. And the Bill of Rights in the Constitution is precisely for the minorities, for the people who don't win elections, for the Sikhs and the Jains and the Zoroastrians whom everyone else might just as well like to neglect and forget about because they're so small. It's really precisely the microscopic minorities that we have a Bill of Rights for. And that's what the judiciary is about preserving. That's what our Constitution is for. And when the President gets up there and says he's going to preserve and protect and defend the Constitution of the United States, it's that is most important to preserve, protect, and defend. The rights of the people who disagree with him, who have a different religious faith, for whom Jesus Christ is not their personal Lord and Savior. Those are the people for whom an elected official like the President is pledged to speak. And I think, you know, that's a very important civic responsibility. And he needs to exercise civic language in a way that's quite distinct from whatever religious language he might want to speak.
Now that's an interesting lead into a question I wanted to ask you about our so-called civil religion.
Yeah.
Which is different, of course, from what may be practiced in any particular religious group. But the religion of the nation, I mean, or our presidents historically have called upon religious values and religious symbols. We've heard a lot of that of late as well. As the country becomes more pluralistic religiously, will our civil religion become more transformed to include the newcomers, so that there'll be references to the so-called new American traditions that you speak of? And actually we saw a bit of this in the recent inaugural by President George W. Bush, where some reference was made to, I believe, one of the texts other than the Bible. I forget now which one it was.
Well, he referred to the character and the values that are instilled by Sinai, meaning the Ten Commandments, code for the Ten Commandments, Sinai, the Sermon on the Mount, and the Quran, and
Quran.
Other religious faiths, he
Yes.
said. Yeah.
Now, that would seem to be a positive sign toward inclusion in our civil religious rhetoric. America under a deity that's broader than Jewish, broader than Christian, broader than any single faith. So we seem to be moving somewhat in that direction. On the other hand, if you look closely at some of the ceremonies, even including the National Cathedral ceremony right after 9/11, where we did have multiple religious traditions represented, but that event concluded with the singing of Onward Christian Soldiers, as I recall. So we get that kind of a crazy mix in our public culture today of nodding a bit to the new religious pluralism, and yet let's hold on to some of the old religious language that is
Just
distinctive
because
to Christian.
they don't have you and I there as the sort of liturgical specialists of the new religious America, where they wanted to hire us to say, how should we do our civil religion? But, you know, we are seeing changes in the way in which religion is recognized in the public sphere. Let's say the governor of Arizona a few years ago issued a proclamation on the occasion of the Buddha's birthday, The governor of the state of Kansas issues a proclamation commending Muslims in Kansas on the observation of Ramadan and the spirit of the Ramadan fast. Or the state legislature in Michigan acknowledging and congratulating the Sikh community on the 400th anniversary of the Guru Granth Sahib, of the scripture of the Sikh community. Or the White House celebrations, I would say, or at least observances of the Eid al-Fitr at the end of Ramadan, which happened just for the first time under the Clintons in the 1990s. Or this year, the White House invitation to the Hindu community for the observance of Diwali, the Hindu fall festival. So these are various ways in which you can see the kind of public nod, the recognition that we as a people are a multi-religious nation. That's happening more and more. Public officials will speak of our churches, our synagogues, our mosques. They haven't quite got to the temples and gurdwaras yet. And there, all of these occasions when, that sort of thing happens. There are some people who are not very happy when that sort of thing happens as well. But that does provide a kind of civic counterpart to the religious rhetoric. But it's a tricky thing. I mean, legislative prayers is another interesting issue. The fact that the Congress opens every day, the House and the Senate, with a word of prayer, an invocation. We have a chaplain, and that person arranges these various prayers. The first time a Muslim ever offered that prayer was in 1991, and we've gradually had imams open Congress with an invocation. A Hindu priest from the Shiva Vishnu temple in Maryland opened a joint session of Congress with an invocation. So gradually that sort of thing has happened. But there are very interesting questions to the limits of that pluralism. I've been following a case in Chesterfield County in Richmond, in Virginia, where there was a list, for example, of the clergy who could sign up to offer the invocation at the county meetings. And usually it was the ministers and the rabbi and eventually an imam. And then a woman wrote up and said, I'd also like to offer an invocation, and she was a Wiccan, a part of a small community of what you might call neo-pagan or pagan practice. And of course they went nuts. They said, they threw it out of court right at the beginning. You can't possibly have a Wiccan opening our county commission meeting. And it went to court. And their argument was that our civil religion is Judeo-Christian. And it is under one God. And you Wiccans don't believe in one God. You have a lot of different spirits. And it's under God who is above. And you Wiccans, have a sense of God within. Mm-hmm. And so you don't really fit the civil religion. Mm-hmm. And they started doing exactly what our county commissions and our city councils should not do, which is to theologize about anybody's religion, but especially about someone else's. And, these are the sort of cases that we look at them and say, this raises the very question of the limits of pluralism, mm-hmm. of the very meaning of pluralism, and it tests the understanding of what we mean.
Yes.
When we say we, and what we mean by our civil religion.
Yes. Before I go any further asking you any questions, I want to correct myself. It was not Onward Christian Soldiers that was sung at that ceremony after 9/11. I'm pretty sure it was the Battle Hymn of the Republic.
Oh, I see. Well,
but it has a bit of the crusading spirit within it. But it's a lovely, lovely piece nonetheless. Mm-hmm. But
let me say a word about Onward Christian Soldiers. But I was thinking about that in the context of the Pledge of Allegiance case, which is another one of those that raises, what do we mean by having under God mm-hmm. in our Pledge of Allegiance? And I remember, as I'm sure you do, when those words were added into the pledge. I grew up with the pledge, one nation, indivisible. It was a very nice sort of flow. And then we had to stop and put those commas and add under God, and I pretty much knew what under God meant. But the very issue of that being signed into law by President Eisenhower in the early 1950s, and then they did play Onward Christian Soldiers. A bugle was playing that in the background as he was signing the legislation for it. And that's made our lives complicated in this day and age because, you know,
It certainly has.
no politician on earth wants to be caught saying we don't want to take under God out of the Pledge of Allegiance. It would be political suicide. And yet, when you look at it from a strictly constitutional standpoint, you look at it through the eyes of many of our new immigrants and our old immigrants, Buddhists, for example, for whom that doesn't really ring a bell, and for whom it might mean actually pledging something that's contrary to their religious belief, or else feeling outsiders to the American project by keeping their mouths shut, or all the atheists who feel outsiders to the American project in general. These are perplexing questions.
Yes, they are. In one of your chapters in your book, you talk about fear, the power of fear,
Yeah.
particularly as it relates to religious pluralism. The fact that your neighbor may believe differently than you,
Yeah.
or may not believe at all in anything that would look like something you might call religion. What is it that really we are afraid of? If we can try to contextualize that in contemporary America. In many respects, we are accustomed to pluralism. You know, I'm old enough, as I think you are, to remember when ice cream only came in the form of chocolate and vanilla and maybe strawberry, and now we've got
Everything.
everything, 30 different options. We've got pluralism in so many realms of life. We believe in choice. We celebrate choice. But religious pluralism can strike fear. What's behind that?
Well, there are two things. One is ignorance, that most people don't really know that much when it comes right down to it about the religious traditions of people unlike themselves. That can mean, you know, like myself, growing up in Montana, I knew almost nothing about Judaism or Jews. I never met any. Certainly, we didn't study anything about Islam, even though a fifth of the human race, and perhaps more, are Muslims. The idea that you could graduate from high school and know almost nothing about the faith and motivation and community and deepest beliefs of a vast swath of humankind, that still happens a bit today. And the same with the Hindu tradition. We really are a nation of functional illiterates in some way when it comes to understanding what it is that the various communities of faith that have become part of our country and that are also major actors in the world today, we don't understand them very well. Now, part of that is that our educational system has not really placed a high priority on learning about religion. For many years, we were a little afraid of it. We thought, well, you couldn't really study about religion. Isn't that mixing church and state? And, you know, we were told in the 1960s with those Supreme Court decisions, of course not. You know, in fact, it's an obligation to learn about religion as part of our history, as part of world history, American history, California history. It's just a fact of life. But we haven't really caught up, in a sense, educationally with the changes in our world and in our society. So that's one thing. Another is that many people come out of religious traditions where part of what they are taught is that their way of being religious is the only way. And here I speak as a Christian who grew up in Protestant Christian tradition, not really an exclusivist fundamentalist tradition, more a social gospel Methodist tradition. But I know that it's true for many people that their way of thinking about the other is framed not so much by the covenants that we have as citizens to respect one another's traditions, but it's framed by the sort of fragmentary pieces of the Christian message that have become a kind of code for how you think about everyone else. I am the way, the truth, and the life. There is no other way to salvation but through me. Or in no other name may people be saved. So there's a kind of Christian exclusivism that runs through the spine of a lot of fundamentalist and general Protestant theology that also devalues people of other faiths and not only doesn't understand them, but has a view of them that is sort of as part of what they might refer to as those who are lost or not on their way to salvation because they're not part of our community. And I think that that kind of theological assessment that is it's very crude, not very well thought out, not very well sort of peopled with actual friends and neighbors who may be devout people of another faith. But I think that also is part of the fear, the hanging back, the inability to really to assess what it is to be neighbor to people who are not like us, to people who are strangers.
You've also written about the need for what you call positive pluralism. Can you tell us about that?
By positive pluralism, I mean real pluralism. I mean not just diversity, because diversity isn't pluralism. Diversity is just a fact. That's, you can deal with diversity in many ways. You can ignore it. You can leave all of these people in their own little isolated ghettos and communities with no interaction or traffic between them. And to me, that's just diversity. But pluralism is the engagement of that diversity in the creation of a common society. And that really is what I mean by positive pluralism. It is, it's the kind of engagement that appreciates the fact that our Muslim and Sikh neighbors are involved in political life, in the life of registering people to vote, as they were during this last election, are involved in social service organizations, are involved in political action organizations and in civil rights organizations that are participants in the society, and not just passively so. So positive pluralism is all about engagement. And it goes beyond the sort of passive tolerance. I mean, tolerance is a good thing, but tolerance is simply too thin a foundation for the level of diversity that we have in our society today. We need to look beyond tolerance to engagement and relationship. I can tolerate people that I have no idea who they are. They're just different. I don't know nothing about them. And the problem is that when that begins to fray and break down, we still have in our minds those half-baked truths, the stereotypes, the sort of misinformation, the no bridge building at all, and we can easily fall apart into fragmentation. So positive pluralism is really the bridge building, the energy that goes into creating the city and regional and national institutions that bring us together.
I think it's the case, and I certainly would like your response, that aside from the bridge building that goes with something like positive pluralism, that is getting to know the other, one might actually get to know more about one's own tradition as a result of the discovery of how similar or how different we are relative to others. So that we ourselves learn a great deal. I too come from a Methodist tradition.
You do.
Growing up in the South.
Yeah.
It wasn't so much a social gospel tradition, more of a Methodist piety tradition. But I believe it's the case that as you encounter the other, you also encounter yourself in a deeper way and know more about who you are. Is that your sense?
Well said. I think it's absolutely my sense. I say it both from personal experience because I've been involved in what is sometimes loosely called interfaith dialogue or interreligious dialogue for many years now. And some of that is sort of organized in a way where, Hindus and Muslims and Christians and Jews and Baha'is all come together to to get to know each other, to talk about issues of justice or poverty or peacemaking, perhaps in particular situations. But in other instances, they are really groups that come together, as is increasingly the case in our society, to do things together. One of the things that's all the rage in various places today are interfaith Habitat for Humanity projects, where we're getting to know each other by building a house together. And that's a great metaphor for what we're actually doing in the world we live in. But I think the testimony of people who have been engaged in this is that you do come to a deeper understanding of who you are, of who oneself is, in the encounter with the other. It's a kind of dialogical learning that is about both speaking and listening. And we need the voices, we need to be able to hear the voices of the many people involved in our communities today and in our nation when we think about the challenges that lie ahead. Because a democratic, multi-religious nation is what we have. We can either do it really well and provide a kind of energy for doing that might in fact be useful or even ennobling or inspiring for others. Because these issues of how you create a multi-religious society are not just America's issues. I mean, these are the old issues and old and new issues of India and Malaysia and Indonesia, and now, Iraq as well.
Certainly.
These are not things that are just for us. A free, democratic, multi-religious society is a bold experiment.
Very bold experiment indeed. It seems to me that that the presence of Muslims in the United States, Muslims in particular, and I might say especially since 9/11, has raised not only the consciousness among Americans of the presence of Islam in this country, but has aroused a good deal of speculation about the extent to which Muslims or Islam can be assimilated into the United States. Now, people on one side say there's a religion that's just too different from Jews and Christians. Then the others say, on the other side, oh, but this is one of the Abrahamic faiths. Mm-hmm. These three actually share a lot in common. If you can overcome all the current fears and stereotypes that go with Muslims in this country as perceived by non-Muslims, that actually we share a lot in common. Now, do you think that portends for the future anything like a new sense of a core religious set of values that will include Muslims actually more at the center of our culture rather than at the periphery of the culture?
Well, this is a great topic, and nothing has interested me more, I will say, in the last 10 years than the study of Muslims and Muslim communities in the United States. I've learned so much from American Muslims and American Muslim communities. Yes, I think on the one hand there is quite a movement in the U.S. today, something called the Abrahamic initiatives, and one will find it in cities and towns across the country where Muslims, Christians, and Jews are coming together to explore their common heritage, monotheistic heritage that shares not only Abraham but quite a spectrum of our biblical tradition together. And both to come to an appreciation of what's in common, but to a clearer sense of the ways in which we're really rather different communities. I will say that I have visited dozens and dozens of mosques in America. Just last Friday, I went to Jummah prayers at the Islamic Center of San Diego. And I have always felt welcomed. I came as a stranger. I sat in the balcony with the women with my headscarf on and was immediately embraced by a small bevy of Syrian grandmothers who were so delighted that I was there and embraced me, made me stay for lunch, and I think, were encouraged by the fact that I was there. Maybe I would be a Muslim myself. There certainly is a very strong confidence in the Islamic community in America and throughout the world that if all of us really knew about Islam, we would become Muslims. That there is something so clearly compelling about Islam. I feel it myself, even as a lifelong Methodist. I feel that Islam is a very deeply compelling religious tradition. And if you go to any mosque, you'll find a dozen brochures that are there for us, for you, for the Hispanic people who come. ¿Qué es el Islam? What is Islam? Because it is a mission religion. Now that's also one of the things that makes people a little apprehensive, that it is a religious tradition of some confidence. And sometimes my Muslim friends are surprised to hear me say this, because when I look at Islam in the United States, I see Islamic centers flourishing. I see an increasing number of Islamic schools where they're making the choice to have private schools, as Catholics did a century ago. And I also see a growing number of instruments of participation, of the voluntary organizations that Muslims have created to be part of the American scene. From the Muslim Public Affairs Council in Los Angeles to the Council on American Islamic Relations, which is the kind of Muslim Anti-Defamation League, if you will, to the recent American Muslim Task Force on Civil Rights and Elections that was about the business of participating in the 2004 election. And all of that, to me, is a very strong statement about the fact that Muslims are here, are present, are interested in participating, are not, are the whole spectrum of diversity that you have in the Muslim tradition worldwide. The recently formed Progressive Muslim Union of North America has brought lots of sort of younger Muslims together, many of them American-born Muslims, to carve out new territory in American Islam. And all of this is just a set of fascinating developments that I think are important for all of us as Americans. The one thing I would say about the Abrahamic faiths, though, is that that's, in a way, the easiest part of dialogue. Mm-hmm. It's maybe difficult because it also, I mean, the Muslims are, along with the Jews, America's second great religious tradition. There are probably about as many Muslims as Jews in the United States today. So, but that's an easy place to begin. And I would say it has its own exclusions. And if that's the core, then what about the Hindus? What about the Buddhists? What about the Jains? What about the Sikhs? All of whom are very much involved and, here as new religious communities. I don't think we want to reform a new core that is Judeo-Christian Muslim without recognizing that in doing so, we're still have these outliers who are not being included in our multi-religious polity.
Well, your answer to this very, very complex question suggests both the promise of pluralism and the perils of pluralism, and both the challenges of an inclusive America, and at the same time the possibilities that we may create new kinds of solidarities that could exclude still others.
Yeah.
So it's the ordeal of pluralism. And it's on that note that we must bring this interview to a conclusion. I want to thank you so much for a very provocative and informative conversation on American religion and the challenges of pluralism in our day. Again, thank you so very much.
Thank you, Clark. It's been great.